Justine, tell me about your book. It's called Tortured When Good Soldiers Do Bad Things.
So my book traces the lives of 4 soldiers who worked at Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo, and it looks at what they went through when they were there, but even more interestingly, what happened to them when they came home and they confronted the people back home, many of whom didn't want to hear anything about what they did, who didn't want to believe what they went through, and if they did believe, really wanted them to have done much more to the prisoners than the soldiers themselves wanted to do.
Why do you think Americans became so comfortable with the idea of torture during the war in Iraq?
Well, I found many different complex reasons, but one of the biggest themes was just the idea that after 9/11, people were so angry and wanted so much revenge. And there's also just this notion that America is supposed to be a superpower. We're not supposed to be able to lose wars. And people don't like to admit that what we're doing is anything less than the greatest. They don't want to believe that we are, in fact, committing war crimes. They like to be able to hold on to this myth of an ideal America, and so even if you admit that we are torturing, people don't want to admit that that's wrong.
What's the difference between what Americans view as what happened in a form that they found acceptable and actual torture? There seems to be confusion as to what torture is, and for a lot of Americans the feeling was, well, they're doing some things there that might be a bit aggressive, but it's really not torture, so let them just do it.
Yeah, there's so much confusion about what exactly torture is, and part of that is a very purposeful attempt by the administration to really parse apart the definition of torture. They looked at the legal definition, and part of it was a question of how severe does pain have to be equal to torture, and then the other thing is it has to be specifically intended, so they pulled that apart. And so often we just focus on things like waterboarding. That's usually the only thing that's in the public debate, when in fact most of the torture program is actually things like sleep deprivation and forced standing and shackling people to walls or withholding food and water. And it's surprising that especially when used over time and in conjunction with other tactics, as is mostly done by the Americans, those in fact cause the same kinds of physical and psychological repercussions as something like waterboarding. In fact, I heard from a detainee say that it was those kinds of things that were so much more difficult to deal with and to get over than things like individual beatings, because at least when you're getting beaten up, you know that it's going to end.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Great, thank you so much for having me.